Hey, everybody, and thanks for following in tonight. Got more trickling in. So, for those of you that haven't met me before, my name is Trevor Freeman. I'm the Public Programs Director here at the Western North Carolina Historical Association, based, as you can see behind me, the Smith McDowell House Museum here in Asheville. Um, we are a nonprofit historical organization. We try to work to explore Western North Carolina history. So a pretty broad place, 23 counties, lots of different stories. And we try to cover a lot of different aspects of that. And I think tonight's program is kind of an example of that. So this is part of our LitCafe series. If you've seen any of these before, we focus on local books, local authors, and people who write about Western North Carolina. Tonight, we bring you Peter Barr, who is presenting his new book on exploring North Carolina's lookout towers. And this book, it's actually nominated for our Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award this year, one of over 30 nominees, so a full field of different topics and different coverages of this region. I'll give you a few little housekeeping things about tonight's event before we get started. So again, this is live, but it will be recorded. All of our virtual events are recorded and usually available on our website within just 2 or 3 days. So I'll send you a link to that, and then I'll also send you a survey if you want to tell us about your experience. A reminder also that we highly encourage you to ask questions. So you have that Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. If you use that throughout the event, we'll try to save plenty of time at the end and try to get to as many questions as we can. But I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit more about tonight's special guest. So Peter Barr, he has served as the Trails Director for Conserving Carolina since 2010 and has led the creation of over 25 miles of trail in the Hickory Nut Gorge. If you've been on some of our outings, you may have hiked on some of those trails. Peter is an avid hiker who has hiked through the Appalachian Trail and reached the highest peak in each of North Carolina's 100 counties and also in 40 different states. He also initiated the North Carolina chapter of the Forest Fire Lookout Association, which works to restore and preserve historic fire lookout towers in Western North Carolina. Peter joins us tonight, I believe he said, from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He and his wife, Allison, are traveling their country in a solar-powered RV. And so, Peter, I will turn this over to you.
Thanks, Trevor. Can you see me okay? Great. Well, I am extremely grateful for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for tuning in to hear about my book and a particular passion of mine, which is historic lookout towers in Western North Carolina. And some background on this book is I first authored its predecessor, which is called Hiking North Carolina's Lookout Towers by John F. Blair, publisher, back in 2008. And that publisher, I feel like, took a flyer on me as a young kid. I wrote that book when I was 23 and 24 and published it when I was 25. And was a really thrilling experience to share a topic that is just so fascinating to me, both as a outdoor recreationist, as a hiker who likes to visit these places and enjoy the view, but also someone who's fascinated with the history of these particular locations and the people who worked and served in these towers and the stories that they had. Fast forward, I guess, 13 years, 12, 13 years, and I had an opportunity that I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute to do not a second edition, but a revised kind of entirely new book about this topic, to do it even more justice, deeper history, and certainly more visual appeal. I learned over those years what I didn't like about the previous book, and what I did like about it and how it could be done better. And it's a topic that's so important to me, and that I want to share with others, and get them excited about as well. I just thought that doing this book over again in a deeper historical way and more visually appealing way would do this topic that I love just so much more justice, and introduce it, and deepen the appreciation among others, to so many more. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. And Trevor, does that look okay?
You're all good.
Okay, great. So the original book, called Hiking North Carolina's Lookout Towers, was primarily it was a hiking guide, but gosh, when I started writing it and the further I got into it, it really was, it turned into a historical guide. And that is, although the subtitle of this, Guide to Hikes and Vistas, doesn't suggest that, this book really is, I mean, it is about 65% really deep and fascinating history, and then almost that much. The numbers don't add up here. Also, this visual appeal of these incredible photographs of my photographer and dear friend Kevin, who I'll tell you about in a moment. But the hiking of this book actually took a little bit of a backseat. It has hiking directions, really detailed driving directions to the trailhead, as well as detailed descriptions of the hikes, where if you took pictures of the pages of this book, you wouldn't get lost. You know how to get there. But there was just so much history and really in-depth stories surrounding these fire lookout towers that this book kind of turned into a history themed book with great visual appeal. So this book came out in the spring in this year, 2001. And it's so exciting to be able to kind of read entirely in book, as I said, to do this topic a whole lot more justice than I did it in 2008. I think most authors will tell you that no one else will notice, but there's so many things I got wrong on the first book: history, hikes, driving directions. And this book was an opportunity to not only correct all those mistakes, but deepen everything and share this topic in a more visually appealing and meaningful way with readers. So one kind of plug I'll make early on is anybody listening to this presentation who, if you find this topic interesting, and you have an interest in, or you end up sharing this passion with me of historic lookout towers in Western North Carolina's mountains, I would be so grateful if you checked out the book. You can buy it directly from me, and that's a way to support local author. This book, Exploring North Carolina's Lookout Towers, is available in a hardback and paperback, which is kind of appealing. The hardback almost seems like a steal. It's like where you're getting it's so nice that it's like a put on your coffee table book. It seems like you should pay more than that. And it ends up being not only a deep historical piece, but just an incredibly visually appealing piece, thanks to Kevin Photo. So I would be honored if you checked out this book, bought this book, supported myself as a local author. I will even sign it for you, and you can do this on nclookouts.com is where you can order either version of the book. So I want to start the presentation with kind of mostly crediting, but also blaming my dear friend, Kevin Adams. Kevin is the photographer for this book. And he's more than that. He's the reason that this book happened. When I wrote that book back in 2006 and 2007, it was published in 2008, of Hiking North Carolina's Lookout Towers. I said that I would never do it again. I would never write another book. Researching about this topic is something I adore. Hiking to these locations and visiting them, experiencing is something I adore and cherish. Writing about this topic is not only quite tedious, but is something I absolutely dread. And I am the classic kind of writer that said I love I love having written, but I hate writing. And because this topic is so important to me, I want it to be perfect. And so it was an extremely tedious process the first time, and even more so the second time. But it's Kevin, the person responsible for all of the beautiful, beautiful, stunning imagery in the book, to credit and blame for this book, because I think Kevin knew that the first book could have been done better and the topic done more justice. And with Kevin's talent as a professional photographer, he knew that he could add something to this, and he knew that I could do even a better job. So Kevin, one time, and we became dear friends over the years, exploring waterfalls and peaks and towers. I had always told Kevin I would never write a book, and I think something about that didn't sit well with him, and he eventually offered the opportunity of, he looked at me one time, we were driving to a waterfall, and Kevin said, well, would it change your mind, or what would you think if I shot the photography for another edition of the Fire Towers book? And I thought to myself in that moment, I could almost flash forward. I told him, oh, shoot, because I knew that was an offer I couldn't turn down, to add that amazing component of his incredibly talented professional photography to showcase these towers, combined with the history that I was so passionate about. It truly was an offer I couldn't turn down. So I said, well, fine. And I think I said that he had to be the one to tell my wife, Allison, who I told that I would never write another book and I wouldn't go through this horrible process again. So I'm so glad that Kevin made that offer, because I'm so proud of this book. I'm proud of his work, and so fulfilled by the effort put into research and find much deeper stories and historical context of these towers, and revisit them all. However, the fact remains that the process of creating the book was arduous, tedious, and incredibly time consuming, but the end result I hope dearly you'll check out. Kevin, just to tell you a little about him, he is Western North Carolina's preeminent waterfall photographer. He has his own book. We share a publisher, which is now known as Blair. North Carolina Waterfalls, now in its third edition. Incredible book. Kevin's been an inspiration and kind of a mentor to me for writing books and being an expert on your topic, and absolutely just consuming yourself in the topic to make sure you are doing it justice when you share it with your readers. So please check out his book, North Carolina Waterfalls, as well. We went on a number of adventures together. This is a picture from the day. We're kind of smiling. I think Kevin is probably smiling slyly here, because he had just talked me into writing this book, and me trying to muster a smile, knowing that I was going to write it and couldn't turn down his offer. Kevin, I knew Kevin for many years before this, and we went on many adventures together, including, here's a picture of Kevin and I and my wife Allison, his wife Patricia. We randomly ended up on the island of Kauai together, and Kevin manages to talk me into a lot of things. He talked me into a really expensive, couldn't afford it, helicopter ride in Kauai so we could shoot waterfalls on this Hawaiian island with our cameras. And like I said, I blame him and credit him, and ultimately I'm so grateful to him for the amazing work he did to make this book such a gem that I feel like it is. In fact, most of the pictures I'm going to show you tonight to kind of illustrate the topic I'll talk about in its history are Kevin. So a big thank you to Kevin, and I hope you'll appreciate his photography and his work even beyond fire towers, including waterfalls. So I'm going to, if anyone says I'm talking really quickly, it's because I love this topic and I have so much ground to cover. So I'll be running through it and trying desperately to stay within an hour. I've never done it. And then eager to take questions at the end. I could take questions for hours and hours, but anyone who's interested in this topic, I could talk fire towers until the cows come home. So thank you again for tuning into this presentation and hearing all about this topic that I love. So a little background on kind of how fire towers, lookout towers kind of came to be and the progression of them. Originally in the early 20th century, there became a kind of realization, especially in a very industrial world where there's a lot of logging and railroads and various industry that could start fires. There became kind of the realization that protecting our forest lands, whether that be for kind of the love of the natural resources or the monetary value of the timber from a commercial standpoint of our forests, if it burned down, that would be quite the detriment to both of those aspects. So in the early 20th century, there started to be a trend both among agencies and governments that would ultimately end up to be agencies that we're familiar with today, like the U.S. Forest Service and North Carolina Forest Service, but also very much among private landowners who held large stands of timber that would ultimately, this was their business, they would commercially profit from these timber stands with logging. The realization that forest fires could cause a dramatic negative impact to the resource. And in particular, in the early 20th century, in the teens, out west in Idaho, Montana, there were several forest fires that ended up that were started via lightning and went largely undetected until it was too late. And ultimately, several million acres of forest, and from a commercial standpoint, that's millions of board feet of timber, were burned and destroyed. So that was a great natural resource and a great commercial resource lost. And there was a realization that if fires could be detected early and they could be managed or put out quickly, that wouldn't have happened. These forest fires out west happened in really remote, rugged locations where no one would have noticed otherwise until a week after the fire started. And they came closer to human habitation. So in the early 20th century, private individuals and various agencies that would evolve into protectors and managers of our forests began to position lookout men and women on top of high summits. And I'll speak more specifically to our mountains in Western North Carolina. This is an image from the summit of Satula Mountain, which is just outside of the town of Highlands. Initially, men and women were just positioned on a rocky crag, and using a device. The man in this image shows what's known as an alidade, and he would actually use this to sight smoke he would see off in the distance, and use it to basically pinpoint the location of that specific smoke and fire. So that way, oftentimes there was a telephone wire connected to these summits. He would get on the phone, radio it down, or call it down into town. Eventually, there would be radio communication, and let firefighters know where these fires were so they could go manage them quickly when they were still small. And so let's see here. And other fire lookout men and women could communicate with this person via telephone, eventually radio, and they could both sight the fire and they could triangulate where the fire was to really pinpoint it. But there were a lot of problems with this technique, just being on top of a mountain. There was lightning, there was intense sun, it would get cold, it would start raining. So ultimately, this became not a completely viable solution for forest fire detection. It was pretty good, but there were improvements that could be made. So next up in the progression of towers, this is an image from the summit of Albert Mountain in the Nantahala National Forest on the Appalachian Trail. And the agencies, even private landowners, began building small little outposts, little log cabins on summits. And this was really just to protect the fire lookout, man or woman. And this was to give shelter for the lookout person themselves. So if there was a storm that come up, they could run inside the shelter. Also, many of these locations deep in what would become national forests were very remote. So they were very challenging to get to, require a day or two hike over rugged terrain. So when they got there, it wasn't really practical to hike down back into town each day and back and forth. So these cabins also provided an opportunity to sleep in. So a fire lookout person could actually stay in these remote locations for several weeks at a time and hike up their supplies and live here. And in this particular picture, you can see there's a ladder and then some slats on the roof. The structure itself gave them a little bit of additional height to see over the trees, see over the brush, and get a little bit higher to better scan the horizon. So they'd literally climb up on the roof and look for fires and smoke on the horizon from the roof of this cabin. But mainly it provided them that shelter from the extreme elements. So next there was the realization, and these especially started coming around in the 1920s, that if we both enclose the lookout person who's detecting these fires, but we also elevated them, we could put them on top of mountains that were even forested. And this isn't exactly an example of that, but that additional elevation would give them a little bit longer sight line, and this could enclose them. And so this is an image of Waya Bald, also on the Appalachian Trail in the Nantahala National Forest, just outside of Franklin, North Carolina, of one of the first iterations of a fire tower. And they were usually built out of wood. And this is what preceded the stone tower on Waya Bald that I'll talk a little bit more in the future. So that was kind of the progression. We eventually ended up with a tower to gain that elevation above the trees, increase sight line, but still enclose the lookout person to protect them from the elements. And the next, especially late 20s and into the 90s, through most of the 20th century, steel lookout towers became particularly popular and effective. These were more durable. These summits are subject to extreme weather and conditions that would deteriorate a wooden tower. So a steel tower became much more effective and durable. This is an image of the Big Ducker Lookout Tower in Watauga County, a little northeast of Boone, North Carolina. This tower isn't publicly accessible, but is a really good example of a steel tower. And the progression of this design was actually used as a conversion from windmills that were used in the Midwest and Great Plains, largely made by the Air Motor Company, which made windmills out of Chicago, Illinois for farms in the Midwest, and then some made by the International Derrick Drilling Company, which made oil drilling wells and structures. And both companies realized that they could make very simple conversions of their designs, and they could put essentially what's a box on top known as a cab, and these could be converted to fire towers. And fire towers outside of the Midwest and Great Plains were needed everywhere. They were needed in the Northeast, Southeast, Southern Midwest, and definitely the West. So there was a great marketability of structures they already created. One thing you'll see in this presentation and a few other examples of different types of lookout towers is Kevin's stunning photography. Kevin has a particular talent for night photography. So you'll see a lot of night photography from Kevin. And this is another depiction of a steel lookout tower. This is a tower featured in the book called the Mount Sterling Lookout Tower in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And Kevin is so talented at doing what's known as light painting, using his flashlight to light up areas, and then light trails and star trails, both for the night sky, and then using a headlamp. I think he walked up and down this tower 3 or 4 times as he took this particular image. So I hope you enjoy a lot of Kevin's just fantastic eye candy to really add to the appeal of these structures. Another type of tower was what's known as the live-in lookout tower. And this type of tower was really popular and implemented by the U.S. Forest Service. And the U.S. Forest Service, which ended up owning and managing tens of millions of acres of forest lands across the country through the Department of Agriculture. These locations tended to be really remote, so they especially appreciated the need to really house the lookout person at these locations. And those tall steel towers that I showed you, typically there was a small cabin adjacent or 100 yards away from those towers where the lookout person would live. They would sleep there and eat there, and whenever they weren't in the tower, that would be their home for a few weeks at a time. The U.S. Forest Service preferred these live-in lookout towers, and these tended to not quite be as tall, usually 30 to 40 feet tall. And these elevated a 14-foot by 14-foot square live-in cab. So it's basically a single room, and it had 1 or 2 beds in it, and it had a cook stove, and then all the equipment like the alidade and firefinder used by the tower operators to detect fire. It had everything self-contained in this 14-foot square room. And these are in Western North Carolina, the type of tower you'll see among the national forests, and lookout persons could live in here. They typically lived in these for 2 to 3 weeks at a time before somebody would come to resupply them, or they would switch places for a few days, or they would hike back into town. Most towers were actually in the national forest reached on foot at first, and then later on roads were built to them. So many of these towers, roads go to them now, but that wasn't actually the case when these towers were built. This is an image of the Cowie Bulb Lookout Tower, also in the Nantahala National Forest, kind of tucked in between Franklin and Silva and Whittier, North Carolina. And here's an example of the alidade used to cite these fires that these lookout persons used. And this device actually, it advanced a little bit in this particular device in the image is known as an Osborne firefinder. And it combined the alidade, the sighting device, with a rotatable kind of topographic map, so that placing the map with the alidade, you could really pinpoint on the map where the fire was. And this was even more effective with phone and radio communication with other fire towers in the distance on peaks on the horizon that they could communicate with. And if they both had a position, they could triangulate the exact position of that fire. And this led to great efficiency of letting folks down in the valley know exactly where it was and where to go manage it and hopefully put it out before it became a ravaging forest fire. A lot of different types, other types of forest fire lookout towers. This is on Hayobald, also in the Nantahala National Forest, but in the extreme western part of Western North Carolina, out west of Robbinsville, near the Joyce Kilmer and Slick Rock wilderness area, Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest. This structure looked kind of like a church or a schoolhouse with a cupola. This was just another kind of style of former lookout towers. The location where the lookout persons would live was in the house at the bottom, but they would crawl up in or climb or crawl, different styles, up into the cupola where they'd have a 360-degree view and be able to spend the day looking for smoke on the horizon and detecting fires. This tower is not featured or is no longer there, but is still featured in the book as a really worthwhile hiking destination. You can still hike to this spot. It's actually amazing how little evidence there is of this structure remaining, but just a very short hike from the summit of Hayobald is the location known as Hangover that has a spectacular view. So I forgot to mention earlier, the book features 28 still standing lookout towers in Western North Carolina, including history, hiking directions, driving directions. About 2/3 of the lookout towers in the book you can drive to within a half mile or less. Sometimes you can drive all the way there. And then the book also features 8 removed lookout towers where the site where the tower was still has a spectacular view and is worth hiking to from a scenic standpoint, but also still has really exceptional history and stories associated with it that I was able to find that I wanted to share with readers. And that's something that wasn't done in the first book. Few other types of towers, or one other type of tower. This is atop Mount Hebron, or Hebron Mountain, just west of Hendersonville, North Carolina, a little bit south of Asheville, near the community of Laurel Park. Some towers were built by private individuals, and sometimes they were built for fire detection to safeguard against fires on their land. Sometimes they were utilized as private kind of tourist attractions. And on top of Mount Hebron, you could drive nearly to the top of this tower and you could pay 5 cents or 10 cents and go up in this tower and enjoy the view. So some of these towers had dual use. It was kind of interesting, the progression of these, and how I think that many of these, like this tower in Mount Hebron, was initially constructed for fire detection, but then they brought onlookers, which they still do today. And I still hope will do so for those listening to this presentation. I hope you'll seek these towers out and go and enjoy their views. This tower has a particular notoriety with its history. It's no longer there today. It's private land. The tower's long gone. But this tower, George Vanderbilt was reputed to have visited in the late 1800s. And the landowner of this tower was a well-known kind of mountain legend. his name was Solomon Jones, of great historical Henderson County fame. He was known as the great road builder, and supposedly George Vanderbilt visited Solomon Jones, climbed this tower, looked out upon western North Carolina, the French Broad River Valley, and decided that this was where he wanted to build his estate that became the Biltmore Estate. So some of that might be legend, there might be some truth to it. It's a little bit squirrely in its history, but certainly makes for a neat story. So these towers have had impact far and wide. So the first modern tower I want to talk to you about that you can visit today, featured in the book, and it's probably one of the longest chapters in the book, is the Shuckstack Lookout Tower in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And this tower, you can drive to Fontana Dam that you see down in the bottom part of your screen. You can actually drive or walk across it and drive a little bit beyond and get to the trailhead for the Appalachian Trail, and hike about 3.5 miles up to the Shuckstack Lookout Tower. And this tower in this particular view is really significant because the tower, and hopefully the next slide shows you the tower, is on top of this sharp peak. It's not a super high peak. It's 4,000 feet, which isn't especially high in elevation for the Great Smoky Mountains, but it overlooks the Fontana Dam and Fontana Lake today. But the tower was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, as were the majority of the towers I'll cover in this presentation, as well as the book, in the 1930s. And so it was built and put into service for fire detection in the mid-1930s. And however, Fontana Dam was a World War II project. It was part of the Tennessee Valley Authority initiative to the great need for electricity production for partially the atomic bomb Manhattan Project effort going on nearby in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, but also primarily as a war effort for the aluminum production of the Alcoa Corporation in nearby Tennessee. So the TVA built a number of dams in the region, and this being on the Little Tennessee River. But they did this during World War II. They started it in 1942 and finished it in 1945, which means the Shuckstack Lookout Tower was present and standing on top of that mountain when this view you see on the screen did not look like that. And it means that a lookout person was in that tower and got to see the bird's eye view of the start to finish construction of the Fontana Dam, which is the highest dam in the eastern United States. And the creation, the damming of the Little Tennessee River, and the creation of Fontana Lake, which is Western North Carolina's largest lake. And unquestionably, this was the single most dramatic landscape change that Western North Carolina has ever undergone. And there was somebody sitting up in a fire tower overlooking a view very similar to this, who got to see that entire progression. Now, the Fontana Dam was built, biggest dam in the eastern US, but was built in only 3 years. And that was done working 24 hours a day. There were 3 shifts a day, 8-hour shifts, working all day, all through the night for 3 full years to finish this project as for the war effort. And what a sight that must have been to see, to view the construction of that dam, and then the creation of this lake, which took many months after the river was formally dammed when the construction project finished. So that's what I find a fascinating story, and what it must have looked like to be in the Shuckstack Lookout Tower in the 1940s. And one of my favorite bits of research that I found in the book for the in researching Shuckstack was the a poem that a tower operator of the Shuckstack Tower wrote about that view of the damming of the Little Tennessee River and the landscape change. And to read this poem just give me goosebumps. I wasn't able to definitively determine if it was written by the tower operator at that time who actually witnessed this, or a tower operator later on who, like us, is imagining what that scene must have looked like and felt like. But nevertheless, it's a very moving poem to think about someone having a really aerial view of that change. The Shuckstack Tower today is a little worse for wear. This tower has formerly towers. I should backtrack a little bit and mention that most lookout towers these days are no longer utilized by the agencies who once needed them for fire detection and natural resource protection. Starting in the 1960s and then progressively more in the 1970s and 80s, aerial detection became more efficient. One person could be paid and you could fly one airplane and cover hundreds of miles of view versus maintaining these structures on these really remote locations and paying individual lookouts. So fire detection, fire towers kind of had its heyday from the 1930s to 1960s, 70s, and tailing off into the 80s. And unfortunately, after these structures lost their original function of fire detection, many of the agencies abandoned them and began to neglect them. And, that was understandable at the time because they didn't need them anymore. And Shuckstack is a victim of that. Several towers, Shuckstack included, did persist for a few more decades because these tall towers in remote locations could be very effective radio tower, so to speak. And Shuckstack was used for the radio communications as a repeater site for the National Park Service in the Great Smoky Mountains for a number of years. And then ultimately, they no longer needed it for that function as well. So it continued to deteriorate and continued to decline in its condition, and to the point of becoming unsafe. And this was the first fire tower that I ever hiked to. And this particular view in this particular tower is where I fell in love with fire towers and the allure of the people who worked in them and the view they had from their proverbial desk where they went to work every day. And I thought it a great tragedy that these towers were just falling apart and soon wouldn't be climbable. This view would no longer be accessible. So more than 50% of Western North Carolina's lookout towers that were there in the 1930s are no longer there. And that's a great tragedy, in my opinion. The history is lost as well as the scenic view is lost. And many others of the towers are in poor condition. And so this is a tower that over the years I've strived to raise funding for to restore, and had some success. Ironically, this is my favorite tower. It's most sentimental to me. Have had some success with this tower. I've had even greater success working with partners to restore other towers and preserve that history and view. This tower was in abysmal shape around 2010, but around 2014, I did not receive a full-scale restoration. You can still see its roof in this image from Kevin. However, it did receive a significant rehabilitation. All of its stairs were replaced with new woods and some railings were replaced, so it was made a lot safer. So the can was kind of kicked down the road of if we're going to save this structure or remove it because it's unsafe. And I'll talk more about fire tower restorations throughout the presentation. And it was the Shuckstack Tower that really inspired the original iteration of this book, Hiking North Carolina's Lookout Towers. And this is an image of the first book, and I'm almost embarrassed at the quality of the photograph on the front because Kevin's photographs make the new book just look so stunning. In 2010, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to through hike the Appalachian Trail, and I used that opportunity to raise money to restore this lookout tower. And as I mentioned, great strides were made. This tower has received a rehabilitation. It is essentially stabilized. The Park Service, their official stance on is that at this time, they're not going to remove it, of which its removal was imminent. The park has removed over 10 other towers within the national park boundaries. The park is not going to restrict visitors from climbing it. That's another significant achievement as these structures deteriorate. And there's still fundraising going on and remaining from that effort. And there's still talks going on with the National Park Service to do something more comprehensive to restore this tower. And slow gains are being made. Just last year, the National Park Service, who utilizes the Friends of the Smokies, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park's primary fundraising organization, the NPS typically goes to the Friends of the Smoky and says, here are what our list of priorities are for. Will you help us raise money for it? The NPS told them last year that the Shuckstack Tower was in the formal wish list to restore. And while that might not sound like a lot because nothing's going on with the tower yet, that's a really big deal. A decade of lobbying and letter writing. I have no doubt that many people on this presentation tonight helped me write letters to the National Park Service, telling them how important the history of Shuckstack was and how important it is to you, helped make that possible. So slow gains, and I'm absolutely convinced that the Shuckstack Tower will ultimately receive its full restoration. This is an image of a former lookout person in the Shuckstack Lookout Tower, and who knows, this could have been the person who wrote the poem, and this could be an image of him looking out over the creation of Fontana Dam and Fontana Lake. So one more image now that I've talked a lot about that, of the view from similar to what you can see from the Shuckstack Lookout Tower and what this must have looked like before and after. Another lookout tower similar to Shuckstack that's near and dear to my heart is the Bear Wall Mountain Lookout Tower. And this also I have strong personal connection to. I hiked to this tower to research for the first book back in 2006, 2007. And I hiked to this grassy, bald summit, and it was just absolutely spectacular. In fact, you didn't even need the fire tower to see the dramatic view. But during that time, there was just rampant development going on in Western North Carolina, and all the forests were getting logged and bulldozed for extensive development of second homes and gated communities, and it was just everywhere you would look. And when I hiked up here, I thought to myself that, wow, this place is spectacular. I love it. I'm instantly in love with it, but it won't remain. In fact, just here, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, a massive, what was calling for 600 or 700 unit high-end gated subdivision was built just on the shoulder of Bear Wall Mountain. And I knew then when I hiked up that there's no way this place will remain. It's a very tall mountain, 4,200 feet, but it has a road up to the top. It's gentle sloping. This is going to be a gated development. This will be my one experience to ever enjoy it. Nothing gold can stay. Just a couple of years later, when I was seeking a career change, I got a call from my executive director, Kieran Rowe of Conserving Carolina, the organization that I've been so fortunate to work for over the last decade. And he was calling me because, and I didn't work for the organization at that time, but I was certainly interested in getting my foot in the door in the conservation. He was calling me to tell me that His organization at that time, known as Carolina Mountain Land Conservancy, was seeking to protect the top of this mountain in partnership with the private landowner. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I had written this place off, this special place. I knew it was going to be destroyed. And now there's an organization who is seeking to protect it for all of time. And Kieran was getting in touch because he was hopeful that I would supply some historical information about the fire tower and the mountain that could be used to increase the competitiveness of a grant that would help purchase the conservation easement on this private land. And not only was I honored to do that, and that was a great kind of achievement of something that came from the book, that I could help be a part of protecting this mountain, even in that small way from my research. But it made me realize that, wow, that organization, Carolina Mountain Land Conservancy, now known as Conserving Carolina, they want to protect this place that's so special to me that not a whole lot of people know about. Hey, I want to work for, that's who I want to work for. That's where I could see having a career. And less than a year later, 7 months after that phone call, I found myself interning for that organization and would start a decade-long and running career. So Bear Wall Mountain has a particular significance to me personally, but the fire tower has great history. In the first book, Hiking North Carolina's Lookout Towers, this was my worst chapter of the book. I have no history, no interesting tidbits about this tower, just hike up the gravel road. Since then, two things have happened. Bear Wall Mountain is now unequivocally the longest chapter in the book, because I have oral interviews from three separate fire lookout operators at Bear Wall Mountain, one of which, Clyde Curtis, who staffed this tower and lived on the summit of Bear Wall Mountain for 35 years. So the things he saw, the stories he had to tell, and that I'm able to relay in the book are truly fascinating and really enrich your experience if you make the short 1 mile hike up to the summit and read about and learn about Clyde Curtis's experience on this mountain for what was the majority of his professional career, and other tower operators, including Judy Tootin, who actually staffed this tower through the early 1990s. This was one of the few towers that made it through the 70s and 80s and was still utilized, in this case by the North Carolina Forest Service, until the 1993 or 1994. So I mentioned Conserving Carolina, the organization that I work for professionally, is the entity who protected this mountain, worked with the private landowner. The land remains private, but they allowed us to purchase at a greatly reduced price from its value, its natural resources, essentially, so that we could conserve them and ensure this property would never be timbered or mined or developed or subdivided, and remain as natural and beautiful as it is today. And I was also fortunate enough early in that decade plus career to begin working with Conserving Carolina and construct the trail up to, with many partners and dedicated volunteers, up to the summit of Bear Wall Mountain, so that others could enjoy this very special place. This is an image of Clyde Curtis, who I was fortunate enough to interview before he passed away. And the book now, thanks to that oral interview and newspaper articles that I found, contains so many of his fascinating stories of his time on Bear Wall Mountain. And that mountain and his time in the tower and all of the things he saw really shaped his life. And I think upon reading those, and there's far too many to convey tonight, will really enrich your experience if you go to the top of that mountain. So next up, there's a handful of lookout towers along the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina. Oftentimes these are on the North Carolina-Tennessee line. The AT, as it's known, has about 350 miles in North Carolina, some of it entirely in the state, some of it on that state line with Tennessee. And in that distance, there's 8 lookout towers. And I'll tell you about, I think, two of them tonight. And one of my favorite stories in the book is the Westerwald Lookout Tower. This is an image of Westerwald in the 1930s. And you can see it was a live-in lookout tower. This tower is 40 feet tall, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. On a really, at that time, remote mountain. Still today requires a gravel road to get to the base of it, and then a mile or two hike to get up to the summit. But the fascinating history with this tower is that a man named Earl Schaefer in 1948, he became eventually what would be the first person to ever through hike the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. And this person had the crazy idea to set out and hike about 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine early in the iteration of what was the Appalachian Trail, this long distance hiking trail that traversed 14 states. And Earl had fought in the South Pacific in World War II, and he got back home to Pennsylvania, and he saw a lot of things that he didn't want to see anymore. And but he was still seeing in his mind. So he kind of quite literally decided to take on this adventure that nobody had ever done. In fact, it wasn't even the original goal of the Appalachian Trail visionaries to hike it all in one continuous journey. But he wanted to forget about a lot of the things he saw at war, and he was going to literally walk off the war. So he set out on this journey, and he would ultimately finish it, becoming the first what's known as through hiker, an end-to-ender of the 2,000-mile AT. And this was a kind of a historical figure that I really developed a fascination with, and I very much felt when I did my own AT through hike in 2010 was following in his footsteps, and loved to camp in some of the same places that he did and take pictures the same locations that he did, to quite literally stand in his footsteps and follow his footsteps. So Earl hiked to the summit a couple weeks into his journey in 1948 to the summit of Westerwald, and he got there. It was still an active lookout tower, and he hiked up to climbed the stairs to the top of this tower, and it was staffed by a lookout person. And the lookout person in this remote location hadn't seen anybody in weeks on end, so was really excited to see Earl, and struck up a conversation and essentially talked his ear off, and eventually invited him to stay the night. And Earl thought he'd normally sleeping out in the woods and getting rained on, so why not have a roof over his head? And the lookout person cooked him a dinner. And Earl records in his journal that they got very little sleep that night, and because they ended up talking about every topic under the sun, and they traveled the world over and fought 3 world wars, and covered 3 decades of politics, and just had a great time catching up. I think by the next morning, Earl was actually ready to go, because this person was so removed from human interaction. He was encouraging him to stay another night. But Earl woke up the next morning and wrote in his journal that he witnessed a sunrise that was unlike anything he had ever seen, in a form of natural beauty, and nothing could compare, even from what he saw in his time in the South Pacific. And so to think of the kind of inspirational moment that Earl had on this tower was meaningful to me. And I was fortunate enough on my AT hike to camp on this tower just like Earl did, and wake up for the sunrise and see what Earl did. So that's pretty neat, but that's not actually what's most significant about this tower. It's what happened when Earl left Westerwald. He hiked on and continued north through North Carolina, and eventually making it to Maine a few months later. But the tower operator was so transfixed with Earl and him doing this epic journey. I mean, in 1948, who hikes 2,000 miles through the forest on this trail, that at that point people knew about it, but because of World War II, it became not a particular focus, or had kind of lost popularity. It really wasn't in the consciousness of many people like it had been pre-war, as this really neat initiative to build a 2,000-mile long trail. So the tower operator radioed ahead to other fire towers along the trail. And I mentioned that there were many other lookouts on the AT further north in North Carolina. And they let the tower operators know that Earl was coming, to be on the lookout for him and to give him a place to sleep and give him some food. So the fascination by the tower operator led to kind of the spreading of word among all the other towers along the AT, and word traveled literally telephone to tower. And word eventually got down into the local communities in the valleys below these peaks. And it eventually got into the local media and eventually the national media. And ultimately, the secret about Earl's through hike and this epic adventure was out. And that became a big deal. Earl was very humble and tried to keep it on the down low. He didn't do any promotion. He wasn't telling a lot of people about this. But eventually he would get to towns, there'd be people waiting to interview him from local newspapers. And that had a profound impact on the Appalachian Trail itself, because post World War II, a lot of the clubs and volunteer agencies, because of war, the Appalachian Trail wasn't exactly the priority. And this entire concept of a national scenic trail, 2,000 miles through 14 states, was kind of losing steam and falling out of favor, or just really not kind of becoming something that people were as excited about anymore. Earl reported that the Appalachian Trail was miserably overgrown and almost unfollowable in countless sections that he hiked. And the press and the news of Earl, the word of Earl's through hike in 1948, that really word got out from the Weserbald Tower. That's kind of where the spark happened, and it was kind of announced to the world. Really served to revitalize interest regionally and nationally in the whole concept of the Appalachian Trail. And in the book, I make I think, a very reasonable argument that Weserbald can be credited in a small way with really saving the Appalachian Trail and helping it stay and become the cherished recreational and natural treasure that we see it as today, and having through hiking and following in Earl's footsteps become a thing. In the late 70s, unfortunately, the Weserbald Lookout Tower's cab was destroyed by arson. But in the early 90s, the U.S. Forest Service and Appalachian Trail Conservancy and Nantahala Hiking Club partnered together and placed a wooden lookout deck on top. So you can still enjoy the view, the same view that Earl enjoyed. And this is another one of Kevin's spectacular aerial imagery. Another tower on the Appalachian Trail in the Nantahala National Forest, just like Weserbald, not too distant, is the Wyabald Lookout Tower. And earlier I showed you a picture of the wooden lookout on Wyabald. This was the tower that came next. This was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, and it was originally 3 stories, and it was built as kind of an icon of the forest. You could drive all the way here back even in the early days, and this was meant to be both fire detection up at those top windows, but also kind of serve as a visitor center for visitors to the National Forest and the Wyabald Lookout Tower, to talk to them about fire prevention, talk to them about the importance of natural resource conservation. That tower, unfortunately, it had faulty mortar and only served for detection for under about a decade, and was ultimately deconstructed halfway and decommissioned for fire detection. There were other Nantahala lookout towers that could serve that need. And so this is generally what the tower looked like from the 1940s to the early 1990s. And it was incorporated, the design of it was, you can see some stairs added on to the right-hand side. It was converted into kind of an observation platform, but definitely didn't look like its former self, that CCC era structure. Ultimately, in the early 1990s, this tower, again, the U.S. Forest Service, ATC, and Nantahala Hiking Club got together and said, hey, let's kind of restore that tower and get it back to its original character. So they added a wooden roof, and it doesn't look like it originally did, but now it is a bit of reminiscent of its original form, still allows an incredible view. And this is what Wyatt Ball looks like today. And here's another example of Kevin's photography, but also his, but especially his night photography with star trails at the Wyatt Ball Lookout Tower. The book contains a neat story about this. The roof that was put on in the 90s was destroyed by a forest fire a few years ago, but restored by the Forest Service and ATC and Nantahala Hiking Club again, to return it to its former glory. The cover image of the book is the Albert Mountain Lookout Tower. This is a 40-foot tower, also on the Appalachian Trail, in the Nantahala National Forest, overlooking the town of Franklin. I was able to uncover some incredible oral interviews of tower operators of this tower, and it was one of the towers. I'm very proud that the first book in 2008 really raised awareness and increased the profile of lookout towers and their historical significance and scenic value in national forest. That this is one of 11 lookout towers that I think partially because of the book was restored to its former glory since the original book came out. Incredible pictures from Kevin, star trails here at Albert Mountain. And of all the pictures I'm showing you tonight, there's probably 6-7 times more than what you'll see here in the book, oftentimes full page. Also on the Appalachian Trail, this one in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the Mount Camera Lookout Tower. Here we see a different, yet another design. This was also constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, who was especially known for the really ornate stone masonry. This tower was constructed out on the kind of precipice of a cliff at the very eastern extreme of the Great Smokies Range, overlooking the Pigeon River Gorge and valley. Yet it's another type of a live-in lookout tower. It was an octagonal room that had the bed and cook stove and everything needed to live. The several stories in the book about the tower operators who lived here for up to 3.5 weeks at a time before going back into town for a few days and then returning. Tower operators would typically do this for about 6 months at a time, typically December to May, or sometimes into June, which tended to be the fire season, and then other times as needed. A lot of neat stories in the book about bears in the Great Smokies breaking out the windows of this tower, trying to get in to get the lookout person's food. For many years, a husband and wife manned this tower, and they ultimately had to install shutters on this tower to prevent the bears from breaking in and getting their food. This tower, built in the 1930s by the CCC, stopped being used for fire detection, as most towers in the Smokies were, mid to late 1960s. It fell into disrepair, was up on the chopping block to be removed entirely in the 1980s. The park decided it would be a tragedy to remove the tower, but they don't have any money to fix it. So in the early 1990s, a few gentlemen came along, and then with increasing support of many other influential folks, decided to fundraise to restore this tower kind of on their own. And they did. They ultimately raised over $50,000 and got donations from the Lowe's Home Improvement in Asheville, and pieced together the funds and materials needed to restore this tower to its former glory, and keep this tower here as a cultural and then scenic treasure of the national park. And that initiative became the first initiative of what would become the Friends of the Smokies, which is now the foremost fundraising organization. I'd say foremost, but in kind of both the Great Smoky Mountains Association and the Friends of the Smokies do great work fundraising for needs of the park. And this was kind of this was their flagship project. So not only did they restore this tower, and it was a great success, but the project itself led to so many other benefits to the park that remain to this day. Friends of the Smokies continue to support the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a place near and dear to me. Here's more of Kevin's incredible photographs taken from the Mount Cameron Lookout Tower in the Smokies. And one final tower on the Appalachian Trail, there's more, but just the last one I'll cover on the AT is the Rich Mountain Lookout Tower. And this is just outside and overlooking above the town of Hot Springs, North Carolina. And the AT formerly went right underneath this tower, and you can see it's a U.S. Forest Service live-in lookout tower. And this tower, incredible views of the Great Smokies, of the Bald Mountains, of the Plot Balsams. You can see almost all the way to Asheville. This tower actually even preceded the Civilian Conservation Corps. The U.S. Forest Service built this tower in 1931 before the CCC even came around. However, subsequent years after it was no longer used for fire detection, which largely scaled down in the 80s, and it was used supplementarily in the 90s for fire detection, but then ultimately abandoned. And here's what happened. And this is one of the towers you can drive all the way to on a gravel road. And that's access is good, but not necessarily a good thing because it suffers a lot more abuse. And this tower was graffitied and vandalized to the ends of the earth. Ultimately, somebody thought it would be a good idea, or maybe they just didn't care, camped in this tower and built a campfire in the center of the tower. Well, you can see its floor is made out of wood. So what do you think is going to happen? Of course, a giant hole formed in the floor, and the Forest Service said enough's enough. They shut the tower down. They removed the lower flight of stairs. They barred access. This structure was no longer safe. This really hit me hard. This was only a few years ago, and this was extremely horrible until a great opportunity came along, and a gentleman named Morgan Somerville with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. I'm there in the center in the red, and Morgan's standing to my right holding the ribbon. Morgan called me, and I had been hounding Morgan for years to hey, what can we do to support and restore some of these towers on the Appalachian Trail, like Shuckstack, because I think they're really appreciated by Appalachian Trail hikers, among others. And Morgan said, hey, I think there's an opportunity here. And we partnered with the U.S. Forest Service and a person, the gentleman on the farthest right, Barry Jones, to apply for a grant through the Appalachian Trail Conservancy in their license plate program. If you've seen the AT license plates as you've been driving around the region, North Carolina has one, Tennessee also has one. And we collectively applied for a grant for funding. And I was excited to point out that 2 legs of this tower stood in North Carolina and 2 stood in Tennessee, which means this particular project was eligible for funding from both license plate funding sources. And we received grants from both of those entities. And Barry Jones took the money that we got through the grant. It was around $13,000, and my Forest Fire Lookout Association contributed, chipped in a little bit. And he knew he had the partners lined up. There were a lot of people who were willing to put their money where their mouth is. And Barry took it to the bigwigs at the Forest Service, and he came back and he took that money and made it go, increased it tenfold. And for near $130,000, we were able to achieve a complete restoration of the Rich Mountain Lookout Tower on the Appalachian Trail outside of Rich Mountain. And if you can see in this picture, we strive really hard to keep the historical character of this tower. So it'd be National Register eligible and still have that same feel to visitors, preserving its cab, keeping the cab and roof wooden, but the floor is made out of metal, meaning nobody can build a campfire anymore and burn the thing down. Damage can still be inflicted, but we tried to make it very, very vandal resistant. We also used part of that grant money to put up a high resolution night vision camera on the adjacent cell phone tower pointed at this camera. So if you do try to have any negative impact to this tower, we will catch you and prosecute you. This is an image of the Rich Mountain Lookout Tower after its restoration. And this is one featured in the book that you can both take a variety of different hikes to, and you can also drive all the way to this lookout, even with two-wheel drive. Another view of the inside of the Rich Mountain Lookout Tower after its restoration, and is a project near and dear to my heart that I was so grateful to be involved with, and so excited that the initial book and interest and steam built for preservation of lookout towers helped make this possible and lead to a coalition of people who really cared and are really proud to preserve this historical resource and this kind of scenic opportunity for Appalachian Trail hikers. More Kevin's night photography on at the Rich Mountain Lookout Tower with his star trails. And as I mentioned, this tower overlooks the community of Hot Springs, North Carolina, where the Appalachian Trail goes down the sidewalk of that little town, and the French Broad River Valley goes over that bridge you see and travels up to this location where the image was, where Kevin took this image, place known as Lover's Leap. And another component about this book that I think is really exciting, and also blame and credit Kevin for, is every tower will have lots of history and historical accounts and oral interviews about the towers, hiking directions, driving directions, information about the mountain and itself and geography. But there's also a sidebar component in the book about associated with each tower. And in the case of Rich Mountain, it's about hot springs and hikes you can take, like this one to Lover's Leap, very nearby the tower. Or you can actually make a loop with the Rich Mountain Lookout Tower and Lover's Leap, starting and finishing at the local bar in town at Hot Springs. So the book has even a greater, I think, kind of diverse content than just the towers themselves. You'll also learn a whole lot about, in this case, the communities around the towers, topics really closely associated with the tower itself or the mountain that it sits upon. Another tower, and I know Trevor had a field trip scheduled here. I think with the recent hurricane and road closures, it might not be feasible, but another tower, probably among the richest history of all the towers featured in the book, is the Little Snowball Lookout Tower, and this is just north of Asheville, located on a spur of the Great Craggy Mountains in the shadow of Mount Mitchell. And the Little Snowball Tower has really great history chronicled in the book, both back when it was served as an active fire detection post by a man named Fabe Webb, who's in this picture, staffed the tower for about 3 decades and was truly a mountain. He was a mountain man. I mean, this guy was a legend. As I was researching and writing, this man made me laugh out loud easily a dozen times of his stories. He used to stand on the catwalk of the tower where he is right now, and he would shoot groundhogs. And then he was very particular on how he would cook those groundhogs, because, I mean, he's in a remote location. He sometimes has to find his own dinner. Really, really rich history featured in the book about Little Snowball, and in particular Fabe Webb and all the adventures and experiences that he had. So that's something that was absent in the first book, and I'm so glad through research I kind of got to know the ghost of Fabe Webb, and now can feel his presence when I hike to the former lookout site on Little Snowball, which you can do if the roads are open. However, that tower was removed on Little Snowball Mountain in the late, 80s. And like so many towers in Western North Carolina. However, a local resident and actually a relative of Fabe Webb thought that would be a tragedy to remove that tower, but the Forest Service is going to remove it anyways. They didn't need it anymore. It's falling apart. It's dangerous. Someone is going to climb it, fall off, and get hurt. So the Forest Service and agencies, this is typical for them to do. U.S. Forest Service, North Carolina Forest Service, National Park Service. They'll put them up for auction to surplus them, and they'll give the public a opportunity to purchase these towers. And that sounds great. Who wouldn't want to own a fire tower? Excellent. Except the hitch is that you're buying the structure, but it can't remain in place. You have to take it down. And there's a great story of a local man named Lloyd Allen, who's a great inspiration and hero of mine. A great story featured in this book. The short of it is that he put in a bid for this tower, and I think he bid like $25, and it was kind of a joke. He wrote it on a piece of paper, crumpled it up, threw out his window at the Forest Service personnel and said, here's my bid. They called him a few weeks later and said, you won the tower. And he didn't really think they were serious. But he and a friend of his actually took apart the tower, not with a crane. It's way remote in the national forest on a rocky summit. Took it apart with just regular tools, piece by piece, and then hauled it down the mountain over the course of the next several years, where for 25 years it sat in storage, disassembled, near Burnsville. And 25 years later, after they took it down, they re-erected it. They raised money and got support and re-erected it on what's today the Big Ivy Historical Campus, in the Big Ivy community, just east of Barnardsville. So this is probably like a 40-minute drive north of Asheville, not too far off the interstate. And what's really significant is not only and I'll show you some pictures here, this is really well done, as you can see. Not only is this the most historically accurate and intact restoration project of a Western North Carolina lookout tower, complete with original Osborne firefinder. There's the radio used by the lookout persons. There's the canteen and hat. There's the original logbook and cook stove from the tower operators of Little Snowball Tower inside this tower. Here's an image of the logbook. And this was a tower that was special. It was only ever manned by two individuals. One was John Allen, and then the other was Fabe Webb, who I mentioned earlier. And this tower was used for nearly 50 years, and only two people kind of served as its post, which was uncommon among lookouts. So the historical accuracy and the level of care used to restore this tower is unparalleled and is absolutely worth a visit. And it is on the campus of the Big Ivy Historical Society, which opens this tower up a couple of times a year. And if you Google Big Ivy Historical Association, and maybe Trevor might be in contact with the Big Ivy folks, this is in Buncombe County, not far from Asheville, might have those dates. I know things have been odd with COVID, but you can go in this lookout tower and see these artifacts up close and personal. But the other significant thing about this tower is that I told you is put up on the campus of the Big Ivy Historical Society. That campus is the grounds of the Big Ivy Historical, or the Big Ivy Civilian Conservation Corps camp from the 1930s. So what that means is that this tower was re-erected, was saved, and then re-erected on the exact ground of the men who built it. And in the valley below, beneath Little Snowball Mountain, sitting in the valley that it used to protect. And that is just something that just gives me goosebumps. This tower was saved, and now it stands on the land of the men who built it and in the valley that it protected. So this is not only one of Western North Carolina's greatest lookout tower restoration and preservation stories, but it's one of the greatest preservation of lookout history in North Carolina, because it is so complete and so well done. And I highly encourage your visit to both the tower, whether it's open or not, and look up a date. Like I said, they open a couple times a year, or you can hike to the site where it stood. And you can still see the concrete footings and still get a pretty good view looking down the Big Ivy community. A few other towers I'll run through quickly featured in the book. This is the Panther Top Lookout Tower in the Nantahala National Forest. This is Western North Carolina's westernmost tower. This is west of Murphy. So this is a decent little drive to get here. But if you do so, it's only under a mile hike to get to this fantastically scenic spot. And 2 weekends a year in autumn, the Forest Service opens this where you can go up in the cab and enjoy the fall colors as seen in this beautiful picture by Kevin. It has its original Osborne firefinder. These are extremely rare. Most of them had been stolen, vandalized, or just walked off over the years. And this was another tower that was restored since the original Fire Towers book came out. Frying Pan Mountain Tower. Many close to Asheville might be familiar with this. You can get there in 45 minutes along the Blue Ridge Parkway and take a 7/10 of a mile hike up to the top. This one's particularly tall. It's 70 feet tall. It was purchased by the U.S. Forest Service, put up later, it's put up in the early 1940s. And purchased supposedly from somewhere down east in eastern North Carolina or South Carolina, which explains why it's so tall. Towers in not mountainous area had to be even taller to see over trees and get a view of the horizon. Now a spectacular view of Cold Mountain, the Shining Rock Wilderness, Allapisca National Forest, and the Blue Ridge Parkway itself. And this tower, Frying Pan Mountain, actually preceded, you use the Blue Ridge Parkway to access it now, but it preceded the Blue Ridge Parkway. And this is what the road used to look like to get to the Frying Pan Mountain Tower. If you were to see this image today, it would be the Blue Ridge Parkway itself, nearby the Pisgah Inn and restaurant and campground. I found incredible oral interviews of lookout men and women in the Frying Pan Mountain Tower who would have to climb this tower when it was covered in ice and would creak as the wind blew, and the tower with all that ice was so heavy they were convinced the tower was going to blow over and fall down. And that's actually a really common thing among towers in the northeastern United States, so it's not an unfounded fear. So many fascinating stories of lookout men and women who served in these remote posts that I don't have time to share with you, but I hope you'll check out the book and read them all. Here's an aerial view. Kevin and I took a plane ride above many of these towers to shoot them. Ultimately determined we couldn't get close enough of them. Then Kevin bought a drone for the to get the images in national forest, although not the national parks. So bird's eye view of the Frying Pan Mountain Lookout Tower just outside of Asheville. And more Kevin's night photography here. This is the International Space Station streaking across the sky that Kevin did with the long exposure. So a lot of not just diverse stories and history about these towers, but a lot of diverse photography. I love this image from Kevin. It's not just about the tower itself, but what you can see from the tower. And then lastly, the book also features, as I mentioned, a handful of lookouts that are no longer there. These have been removed, but they're still really worthwhile to visit the site, both because they're still scenic, and there's a lot of fascinating history to be appreciated with these sites. This is an original image of the very short lookout tower at Sassafras Mountain. This is on the North Carolina, South Carolina state line. Sassafras Mountain is actually the highest point in South Carolina, but it's half in each state. And it is in southern Transylvania. You access this in southern Transylvania County, and was a kind of squat steel lookout tower. And here's an adjacent cabin where the tower operators lived. And the book has several stories about mountain lions killing the hogs that the tower operators kept in the backyard of this cabin because they would use them for food. While the tower was removed just a few years ago, it was replaced in a great conservation project in partnership with Conserving Carolina. I had the great fortune to be involved with a decade-long project conserving and acquiring the what we called the East Fork Headwaters, now known as the nearly 8,000 acre Headwaters State Forest, in partnership with the North Carolina Forest Service and the Conservation Fund. And South Carolina Department of Natural Resources came in and decided to make a bigger deal about what was their highest point in the state of South Carolina, which I think was a really neat thing, especially because there historically had been a tower there, and they built an accessible kind of stone and concrete lookout platform on the summit of Sassafras Mountain. So you now can see the view that was very similar to the original fire tower that stood there, built by the CCC in the 1930s. This is a tower that you can drive to within 100 or 200 yards for, or take a much longer hike and get here on the Venerable Foothills Trail. Here's an aerial view Kevin did of the new lookout on Sassafras Mountain Tower, and this tower is only a couple of years old. And a view looking into the Headwaters State Forest, another place near and dear to my heart that I had the privilege to be in a small way involved through Conserving Carolina with the conservation of this very special place, the actual headwaters of the French Broad River. And then this is an image of Spivey Mountain Lookout Tower. This is just west of downtown Asheville. In fact, if you're anywhere near downtown Asheville, you can look west and you can see a tall tower. Those are cell phone towers on a small peak west of town. It used to have a fire tower that was used by the North Carolina Forest Service until the 1990s. It was taken down, put into storage for a while. Here's an aerial view of Spivey Mountain. You can see the communication towers having popped up. And once it was taken down, though, it was preserved. And so this is a different form of fire tower preservation. The very top portion of it was kept and was erected in the mid-1990s in Holmes Educational State Forest in southern Henderson County. And this is now, you can not only go visit it and see and learn about a lookout tower, you can actually hit a button and it'll play a audio recording of someone manning a fire tower. And when I hit that button, it gave me goosebumps because it turned out to be Clyde Curtis, who was staffing the Bearwall Mountain Tower and in radio communication with the Spivey Mountain Tower. So while not all towers are tall and scenic, they're still worth visiting. And this one in Holmes Educational State Forest is definitely rewarding in its own right. And then I think this is the last one, a tower that's no longer there, that's been removed, but you should absolutely still visit. This is the summit of Table Rock Mountain on the east rim of the Lindenville Gorge in Pisgah National Forest. And this used to be, as you can see, not a tower. This was just a what's known as a lookout house. Live-in lookout house. So the 14 by 14 foot room put at ground level, they didn't need to elevate this structure because it was on this rocky promontory above this dramatic gorge. So no trees in the way, on a very prominent peak. All they needed was a house with windows. And this is a tower that was moved in the 1970s to 80s. But the summit itself is still a rocky outcropping that has a spectacular view, and you can still see the foundation. Here's another image of the tower perched on the very edge of the cliff. That's the eastern rim of the Lindenville Gorge itself. Ultimately, the tower was destroyed. The Forest Service decided to decommission it, burn it down, get rid of it. They weren't using it anymore. This is it on fire in the 1980s. But you can still visit the mountain. That is the shadow, the silhouetted outline of Table Rock Mountain that Kevin took. And in the foreground here, I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, but is the foundation of the tower. So absolutely a place worthy of hiking to enjoy the view, but also kind of experiencing the presence of this tower. I found a lot of neat history associated with this tower, and including a husband, wife, and small child who lived and staffed this tower for a number of years. And what a spectacular place this must have been for this to be your job. How lonely and remote, but how stunning every day that the view from your proverbial desk was exactly this. other neat allure is that the Brown Mountain lights are the kind of paranormal or mythological visual phenomenon of light orbs floating above Brown Mountain, which is one of the broad peaks in this photo out in the distance, kind of center view of the image. Or actually kind of towards the right. I'm sorry, we're looking in the other direction. But that if you were staffing this tower and you lived on this summit day after day and you spent all the nights there, like you surely must have seen the Brown Mountain lights countless times. So thinking about the experiences and what the tower operators saw from Table Mountain is yet another thing within the book that gives me goosebumps that I love to think about, and especially when I'm there, look out and imagine what the tower operators saw during their time. I appreciate everybody who's still with me. I know it went long, but believe it or not, you're getting 10% of what's in the book. And I hope that my excitement and passion for this topic rubbed off on you. And I hope you'll check it out and be willing to buy a copy of the book. And like I said, I'll sign it for you. But most of all, I hope you just fall in love with lookout towers like I have, their history and their scenery. And I think they're just the absolute best place to hike to in Western North Carolina. Really fulfilling experience. So I'd be happy to take any questions. I know I ran long, so anybody who has to check out, no problem, but I could answer questions until the cows come home. So feel free and let me have them. And as I mentioned, nclookouts.com is where you can pick up a signed copy of the book, paperback or hardback. And I'm super grateful for your support.
Thank
Trevor,
you,
you still there?
Yeah,
Great.
yes. Like Peter said, we'll take any questions anybody has. I'll brief you a little bit on some of our upcoming events. Peter alluded to the outing we have at Big Avi coming up. Peter, I've got a question for you right fast. One thing that stands out to me is, obviously you and Kevin had some adventures taking the modern photographs of these towers, but looking at some of the historical photographs, how did you find some of these? These are some really obscure photos. I mean, I've looked for a few of them myself before, and it's never an easy process finding them.
Yeah, well, thank you, Trevor, for that. Because I would say I probably put as much time into the research of the writing of the book as I did the historical photographs. Took an equal amount of time, and but I was really moved by the historical photographs, kind of the comparison between now and back then. But they weren't easy to find, and I also discovered that I feel like I didn't do a very good job of it with my first book back in 2008. And so the short answer is a lot of digging. These came from so many different sources. A lot of them came from the U.S. Forest Service archives, and I spent, you might have been there, many of your colleagues, a little tiny room full of drawers with slides in it in the U.S. Forest Service office on Zilcoa Road in Asheville. Of course, all of those slides are they're old, right? So they're poorly labeled, and many of them are mislabeled. And I eventually knew enough about my topic, I could kind of sniff out the ones that I'm like, that's not that tower, and other ones that weren't labeled at all. But I found that, hey, that's this. And but the Forest Service archives, kind of the bowels of the Forest Service archives, was only one of the places. There were other entities like the Forest History Society, which I think is kind of a component housed within Duke University, and the North Carolina Forest Service archives. And this became really challenging to find in the kind of the state of North Carolina archives themselves. The North Carolina Forest Service used to be called, and forgive me for not being completely accurate here, but something like the Department of Forest and Conservation Resources. It was a basically what's today state parks and North Carolina Forest Service combined into one entity, and they were that way back in the 30s when these fire towers came about. So the archives for that, all of these old resources are miserably disorganized and incomplete, but after dozens and dozens of hours for each one, I would spend days at a time hunting down one, and then when I'd find it, it truly was like a treasure, and really meaningful to me, and I hope others will enjoy it too. And then even a few of these, I hunted down. One benefit to writing the first book is within a year or two of writing the first book, I had so many people come to me after I did book signings and presentations and give me additional resources, photographs, and direct accounts of, their grandfather worked in these towers. And so it's like within the first year of that first book, it was instantly out of date. And I realized the breadth of information that was out there that I didn't include. So it was another reason for excitement to include all that in this book.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. The resources you mentioned, I can imagine combing through those it could have been a tedious process.
Oh, one more, Trevor, is it's called the Dutch Roth Collection, which is at the University of Tennessee, and that is a photographer in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, a big photographer of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, who kind of palled around in the era of Harvey Broom and later era of Horace Kephart and George Massa. That's an incredible resource specific to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And anybody who's just interested, whether it be fire towers or Great Smokies history, I often spend hours upon hours. They have a great online digital resource, Dutch Roth Collection, University of Tennessee, of viewing those photographs. So a lot of the Smokies ones came from there, and I'm eager to recommend that to anyone who's interested.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I want to take just a quick second and brief you a little bit about what we have coming up at Wincha. We actually have an event this Saturday. So let me share my screen with you right fast. As we talked about, we have plenty of outdoor experiences. So we have a paddle coming up on the French Broad this Saturday, 7-mile paddle through one of the most historic sections of the river. We're using canoes. You have an option to bring watercraft of your own, and there are a few tickets left, so encourage you to check that out. Look forward to seeing you all there. I'm leading this hike, or leading that paddle. We are partnering with Swananoa Valley Museum to bring this Guastavino marker dedication on the 13th. And then we're back with another outdoor experience, the Big Ivy Historical Park that Peter was talking about. Initially, we had planned to hike to Little Snowball Mountain and see where the tower itself used to be. The recent rains we've had have kind of made that impossible right now, but we're still going to the park. You can still see the tower, still see the remnants of the CCC presence there. And we'll learn a lot about the Big Ivy community and look at even broader things in Appalachia and what Barnardsville and that community say about that. So I want to just thank you all again for tuning in tonight. Just a reminder, this event will be recorded, and you'll get an email within just a couple days letting you know that it's available on the website. We'll send you out a survey also. But in the meantime, check in on our events page on our website, wnchistory.org. And we hope to see you at some of our upcoming events. Just want to say once again, thank you, Peter, for joining us tonight. And thank you for this awesome book that's hopefully going to inspire a lot of outdoor experiences in the future.
Thanks, Trevor.
Well, thank you all. I wish you a good night, and I'll see you next time.